Opening up avenues for the bishop and preparing to contest the center is a sound start. Developing the knight to its natural square mirrors white's intent, securing central influence and preparing for rapid piece deployment. Preparing a fianchetto, controlling the long diagonal and potentially eyeing the kingside with a bishop development. Preparing a fianchetto, black mirrors white's strategic intent, aiming for a solid pawn structure and active bishop. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal creates immediate attacking pressure on black's queenside and prepares castling. Asserting central presence immediately, black plants a pawn to challenge the established flank development and open diagonals for their bishop. Solidifying the center now offers robust control and prepares a central pawn storm, potentially stifling black's kingside initiative. Developing the bishop to g7 solidifies the dark squares and prepares for castling, aligning beautifully with the fianchettoed structure. Unleashing a pawn storm, white immediately contests the central dark squares and aims to disrupt black's harmonious development. Black accepts the pawn, initiating a dynamic pawn race and temporarily ceding central influence for piece activity. Snatching that pawn with tempo, white forces a decision and disrupts black's pawn structure, potentially opening lines towards the weakened king. Dodging that annoying check, black sidesteps immediate trouble and begins consolidating a potentially precarious pawn structure, prioritizing piece development over material recovery for the moment. Safeguarding your monarch is paramount, especially after a tactical skirmish, allowing for future piece development and central influence. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight develops a piece and prepares to contest the center, a sensible response to white's aggressive pawn grab. The queen's aggressive placement here, snatching the pawn, forces immediate attention and dictates the subsequent tactical exchanges. White gains a tempo, but exposes their queen to potential harassment, creating a dynamic imbalance as the center solidifies around the captured pawn. Observe how this queen activity might influence the development of black's pieces and the control of open diagonals. The king finds safety behind a phalanx of pawns, a fundamental priority in the opening, while preparing to integrate its rooks into the game's unfolding drama. Reasserting central presence and preparing to contest the open d-file, white mobilizes its rook to a square where it actively supports the pawn chain and eyes potential breakthroughs, seeking to exploit black's slightly passive bishop placement on g7 and the isolated nature of its queenside majority. Asserting control over central squares becomes paramount as the knight infiltrates the queenside, challenging white's advanced pawn structure and hinting at a potential kingside siege. Re-establishing central pressure, this queen maneuver clears the d-file for the rook, preparing to contest open lines and simultaneously guarding against any premature attempts by black to exploit the queenside pawn structure. Launching a bishop to e6, black endeavors to challenge white's queen and simultaneously develop a piece, aiming to break white's central grip and potentially prepare for a queenside pawn advance. This maneuver seeks to untangle black's position from the slightly cramped setup it has occupied, creating more active possibilities. Preparing to assert pressure along the c-file, this repositioning allows for future pawn advances or the potential for increased piece activity on the queenside, while defensively consolidating the queen's position against the immediate threats. Unleashing the bishop to a more active diagonal, this maneuver directly challenges white's queen and begins to exert pressure on the queenside while simultaneously opening lines for black's pieces. The queen's repositioning to b3 aims to regroup, potentially prepare for an e4 push by adding pressure along the b1h7 diagonal, and avoid the pin on the c-file while still maintaining some influence over the center. It's a subtle dance, trying to find a more harmonious placement after the earlier capture and subsequent exchanges. Unlocking the queenside with a pawn advance like this can really shake up the current positional equilibrium, potentially disrupting white's comfortable setup and forcing them to address new threats. Bolstering the center and preparing for kingside expansion, this knight strategically supports the e4 advance while aiming to control key squares. Sharpening the attack on the queenside, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially secure more space, But this advance may create weaknesses on the dark squares that white could later exploit. Recapturing the pawn with the queen might seem obvious, but it strategically opens lines for black's bishop and potentially prepares a quick queenside expansion. Repositioning the rook to the wing suggests an intent to support a queenside pawn advance or perhaps to contest the open file, though it currently feels a bit disconnected from central play. Shifting the knight back to b1 abandons the immediate pressure on black's queenside and signals a positional reassessment, prioritizing piece harmony and king safety over aggression. Unleashing an audacious knight thrust, black boldly targets white's queen and threatens a fork, while simultaneously rerouting the knight to a more aggressive diagonal. This audacious maneuver challenges white's already slightly awkward queen placement and introduces significant tactical complexity, forcing white to react immediately to avoid material loss or a severely compromised position. The immediate consequence is that white's queenside structure is under pressure, and the coordination of white's minor pieces might be disrupted as they scramble to defend. Reclaiming the kingside rook, white repositions to defend the e2 pawn, which was under indirect pressure from black's bishop on c2, and prepares for a potential advance of the central pawns. Snatching the pawn with the knight creates immediate tactical fireworks, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious setup and potentially gain material or initiative. But it also opens up avenues for white's pieces to develop a powerful central presence and counterattack along the open files, demanding precise calculation from black to avoid falling into a strategically inferior position. Suddenly, the knights engage in a tense exchange, simplifying the position while potentially opening lines for white's rooks. By capturing the knight on d4, white not only removes a central defender but also aims to seize control of the now open d-file, a crucial avenue for future operations. This maneuver could also disrupt black's pawn structure and create weaknesses around their king, especially if white can follow up with aggressive piece play. The symmetry of the knight's sacrifice and recapture creates a dynamic imbalance where white hopes to leverage their improved piece activity. Recapturing on d4 with the bishop unleashes a surprisingly potent counterplay, forcing white's pieces to reevaluate their entire setup. This aggressive bishop move not only challenges the central pawn structure, but also creates a dangerous battery along the a2-g8 diagonal, potentially eyeing white's king if it ever ventures towards the queen side. White's previous queen repositioning now looks awkward, as the bishop's presence on d4 disrupts any comfortable knight development or rook activity on the d-file, opening up opportunities for black to exploit the slightly uncoordinated white army. The queen retreats, a strategic repositioning to avoid the immediate pin and to exert pressure along the third rank, while also preparing for potential counterplay on the king side. Initiating a daring knight maneuver towards the king side, preparing to support a potential pawn storm on the h-file. Opening the kingside diagonal for the bishop and preparing to challenge black's queenside initiative are the immediate goals now. Reshaping the central pawn structure, black opts to regroup the bishop, aiming to bolster its influence on the long diagonal and potentially prepare a more active role in the queenside fight, while also securing a tempo advantage should white's rook advance further along the f-file. Navigating the queenside pawn structure, white redeploys the knight with the intention of reinforcing the queenside and potentially probing the weak squares around black's king. Black continues to develop, bringing the bishop back into play, seeking to redeploy it to a more active square and contest the central light squares. Seizing the weakened dark squares with the bishop's intervention opens a direct assault on the queenside pawn structure, potentially isolating black's advanced pawns and creating long-term structural disadvantages if black fails to consolidate the kingside. Black strategically repositions the rook to a more active file, challenging white's queen and preparing to disrupt white's central control by potentially targeting the vulnerable c2 square. The bishop returns to its initial square, a seemingly passive repositioning, yet it clears the path for the rook to potentially engage on the now open d-file and prepares for a coordinated pawn push on the kingside, aiming to gain crucial territory and restrict black's pieces. The queen sidesteps the immediate threat of the rook, preparing to contest control of the d-file and potentially eye open lines towards the white king. The queen's repositioning to the queenside aims to exploit potential weaknesses along the file and pressure black's pawn structure. This maneuver potentially offers white a more active role, seeking to untangle pieces and find attacking avenues after a somewhat passive sequence. Consider how this queen placement might influence the d6 pawn, forcing black to dedicate resources to its defense, which could slow down counterplay. The move creates a tactical knot, forcing black to carefully evaluate the safety of their king and the potential for unexpected tactics. By vacating the d1 square, white might be preparing to reroute pieces, perhaps a knight to a more aggressive post. This queen excursion could be a strategic gambit, sacrificing some immediate central influence for a more dynamic queenside presence. Think about the long-term implications of this piece activity. Is it a prelude to a pawn storm or a subtle positional squeeze? The queen's new vantage point allows for a broader view of the board, potentially identifying and exploiting subtle imbalances. White is clearly trying to inject some dynamism into the position, moving away from the previous symmetrical exchanges. It's a probing move, seeking to elicit a reaction from black and understand their defensive plans. Black chooses to untangle their bishop, repositioning it from the cramped f5 square to the more active e6 diagonal, potentially preparing for future advances or supporting piece exchanges. Unleashing the center pawns after a period of maneuvering, this aggressive push aims to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn chain and open lines towards the monarch. Unleashing the queen from its recent confinement, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's harmonious piece placement, particularly targeting the momentarily exposed knight on c3, and potentially setting up a dynamic pawn push on the queenside to gain vital space. Opening a critical diagonal for the queen, this action aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially expose the king. Repositioning the rook from the contested central file to the semi-open d-file offers enhanced influence over the battlefield, potentially supporting a future pawn push or preparing for a defensive redistribution of forces. Unleashing the rook to contest the open file, this maneuver initiates a subtle battle for central control, aiming to dislodge black's pawn chain and potentially exploit imbalances created by the bishop pair. The rook's repositioning to the open file creates an immediate threat to the queenside pawn structure, forcing white to consider defending against potential advances. A curious retreat, preparing to contest the d-file, yet it surrenders the initiative on the queenside and allows black to consolidate their pawn majority there. Snatching that pawn opens up a dangerous diagonal for your queen, potentially unleashing a devastating attack while simultaneously exposing your king to counterplay. Unlocking the diagonal for your bishop, this repositioning aims to create greater influence over the d5 square and potentially prepare for future central breaks or attacks against black's king. Challenging white's queen placement, black repositions the queen to exploit the exposed bishop on a2, initiating a dynamic counterplay that questions the safety of white's entire queenside structure. Seizing initiative by capturing the pawn on c7, white aims to disrupt black's queenside structure and potentially create attacking chances against the now exposed king. This aggressive thrust forces black to react and defend, potentially loosening their own pawn shield further. Seizing the initiative, black plunders the unprotected bishop, daring white to address the immediate threat on the queenside while simultaneously clearing a path for their own rook. The audacious capture of the rook on d8 fundamentally alters the material balance, forcing a stark reevaluation of black's precarious pawn structure. Black's rook reclaims its vital outpost on the d-file, a crucial defensive maneuver to protect the exposed king and contest white's newfound control of the center, while simultaneously preparing to challenge the powerful bishop on g2 and potentially generate counterplay along the open files if white falters. Opening the rook to the d-file decisively capitalizes on black's misplaced bishop and initiates a powerful queenside assault, aiming to dismantle black's pawn structure and exploit the open lines. The queen's daring foray to d2 plunges into the heart of white's defenses, a provocative challenge that seeks to unravel the tightly woven pawn structure and exploit the open lines for counterplay. Reclaiming the queen ushers in an endgame where white must leverage their extra pawn and the open c-file for a potential breakthrough, carefully avoiding any counterplay from black's bishop on g7. The forced exchange on d2 fundamentally alters the strategic landscape, ushering in a queenless middle game where black's rooks now command open files, particularly the d-file, after the d8 rook's redeployment. Expanding pawn presence on the queen side now aims to contest the now open b-file, perhaps eyeing eventual control or even a pawn push to restrict black's rook activity. Black's bishop now seeks a more active post on the long diagonal, hoping to create counterplay against white's exposed king. Capturing that pawn opens the b-file, a significant territorial gain for white in this endgame, while also forcing black to commit their bishop to a potentially passive square. Sacrificing the rook to create a passed pawn offers a glimmer of counterplay in an otherwise grim position, but the resulting pawn structure is likely to be too weak to withstand white's material advantage and active pieces. The monarch now retreats to a safer corner, a sensible precautionary step given the recent chaotic exchanges and the open nature of the board. It's about ensuring your most crucial piece isn't caught in the crossfire of potential immediate threats. Boldly seizing an open path, this knight daringly infiltrates white's territory, aiming to disrupt the established pawn structure and potentially isolate the king amidst the remaining pieces. Shifting the knight to b5 initiates a tactical hunt, aiming to exploit the potential weakness on c7 and simultaneously prepare for future pressure along the file should black's pieces remain uncoordinated. Securing the bishop's escape route after a daring sacrifice, this maneuver aims to reactivate a potentially trapped piece and prepare for a defensive consolidation. Securing the king's safety is paramount now, tucking him away from potential checks along the now open diagonals and files. Unleashing the rook to d2 aims to contest the d-file aggressively, but it relinquishes crucial defensive support for the light-squared bishop, potentially exposing the king if white can exploit the open lines. Returning the king to its previous square now solidifies its safety, a vital consideration given the exposed nature of the remaining pawns. Black aims to exploit the newly opened b-file, potentially using the rook to attack white's pieces or create threats along the rank. Navigating the knight to a4 opens up a subtle but important repositioning, aiming to bolster the queenside defenses and potentially find a more active outpost than its previous central position. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside offers a dynamic shift, aiming to disrupt white's recently centralized king and potentially open lines for attack, though it may also create weaknesses in black's own pawn structure. Consolidating your position, the bishop now eyes the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially support a future advance. Unleashing a pawn storm with a king exposed on the wing can be a double-edged sword, creating potential chaos but also leaving weaknesses. Activating the knight to a central outpost offers fresh attacking possibilities, eyeing vulnerable squares on black's queenside while simultaneously reinforcing white's queenside pawn structure.